No,
Sorry
I
to
went pretty far.
interrupt.
Thank you, Olivia. Uh, now is it recording? Yeah.
Yeah, you're good now.
All right. Well,
Sorry.
I'm not gonna bore you guys now know something no one else will ever know. But I'll briefly hold these up again in the recorded version in case anybody tunes in. Just to briefly summarize my last 10 minutes. In melodrama, modernity has moved from the triadic relationship where we organize around a soul and sacrifice to the binaristic relationship where we organize around investment, acquisition, instrumental rationality. And issues like authenticity and value become extremely narrow in around the self-construction. Like there's a very strong a kind of relentless valuation system in modernity relative to the self, but it's so focused and it forbids alternative methods of recognizing value and authenticity and significance. And that's the biggest problem is this has what's kind of unique about modernity as a socioeconomic phenomenon is that given through technology, mass media, mass consumption, it's able to be ferociously narrow and in such a way that makes it seem like it's the entire horizon. There's a lot of metaphors of expansion, which is often accompanied by both the music and or the image. So the very concept of the camera going into a wide shot, an aerial wide shot, where it's now moving through the whole town, with no visible means of support. It's not even a point of view shot. We don't get a shot of Lester's face. I mean, this seems to be what he's seeing, but he's not an anchored person within the secular world when we are shown his viewpoint. So it's a movement from rituals. This is the point I think I was making before Olivia kindly reminded me to push record, that the one reason that addiction is so unhelpful, it's a strange word, but in this context, is that it's incapable of calling you back to the degree that you may have drifted from fixed morals and principles. In Broken Blossoms, it's pretty specific that Cheng Huan, in that time jump where he's suddenly in London, in the Limehouse district, leaning against a wall. We're not sure how much time has passed. Not a huge amount, but certainly more than a few days or weeks. And now he's lost his dreams, and now he's taking opium and going to the opium, frequenting the opium den, and has clearly, I think the title card says, but can he hear the temple bells? So that there you have you have an aural, AURAL, an aural equivalent of an anchoring point, the temple bell. And of course you hear the shrill boxing bell, but you don't hear the temple bell until the very end. And then you can hear the temple bell again, and we see it getting struck again. And this is how a soundtrack in melodrama can work. The soundtrack of American Beauty is obviously very, very sophisticated compared to Broken Blossoms. And in fact, we don't know for sure what the quote unquote soundtrack of Broken Blossoms would have been. I mean, one of the features of silent movies is there may have been some understood music associated with the movie, but it was played live at the discretion of the theater organ player or piano player. So it would have been kind of different depending on performances, whereas American Beauty's soundtrack is very, very tightly the song and the images are tight, and it doesn't vary. You don't miss notes. They're a part of the movie, and yet the soundtrack is also not clearly. It's not a identifiable orchestrated sound. Usually, there's a kind of a there's a staccato, which typically seems to signal interiority, going inside Lester's hopes and dreams. I mean, it's very predictable when that music starts. You do have a lot of silent scenes in American Beauty, where there's no dialogue, and they're among the most memorable um, of the scenes. But in particular, of course, the bleacher scene where he first is convinced that Angela's in some kind of transcendent dialogue with him, that reduces him. Well, he experiences it as expansive, but this is an interesting case where the editing goes against the implied subjective feeling. Like the way the close-ups of Lester's face makes it look like he's having an ecstatic experience. His jaw goes slack, his eyes are wide open, he's mesmerized and fascinated. But the editing shows him as more and more isolated. Like every time the counter shot comes back, he's more alone. There's less and less reality around him until finally he's literally the only one sitting in the bleachers. And to some extent, that is the visual equivalent of addiction. That at every moment where he becomes more and more convinced of the euphoric, ecstatic effect of Angela's cheerleader routine, the reality is he's getting more and more isolated. There are other movies that actually feature drug addiction. That Basketball Diaries with Leonardo DiCaprio has a very effective scene where we're given the point of view shot of DiCaprio in nodding off after using heroin, and he's in a field of daisies and he's kind of floating around, and then we have a brutal cut to the fact that he's passed out in an alley with in filthy clothes and one shoe, and that's not quite so brutal in American Beauty, but there's a touch of that. Is your ecstasy, is it ritualistic or is it addictive? Because if it's ritualistic, the ecstasy will also be disturbing, because it's when Lester moves from a sort of investment to sacrifice, like he invests through his workouts in earning Angela's promise that he's overheard that she would have sex with him if he just worked out a little bit. So he understands that's something modernity can understand. If you want this prize that it feels like it would complete you somehow, then here are the steps you have to take. Here's how you have to invest, and then you will get your return. So it's probably the single most transformative moment of the movie, that he, if you will, squanders his investment when it's finally the moment, and she says, "This is my first time," and then she quickly adds, "I still want to do it, but I just wanted to tell you in case I wasn't very good." And then we see everything change about him, his posture. He leans back, and in a gesture that's almost identical to Cheng Huan, his forward movement toward what could have been sexual gratification literally veers off, and Cheng Huan, I think, kisses the hem of her sleeve, and I don't know if he kisses Lester kisses anything, but his head goes off to the side, and then he sits back up, and then we get this new translation of beauty, because beauty becomes this term, American Beauty, the roses, the Angela's physical beauty, but what about spiritual beauty, and how is it a plastic bag can be the most beautiful thing that Ricky Fitz has ever filmed? So that's all by way of setting the table here, but I thought what we might start out with is invite you guys to this is overstated, of course, but if you were to try to make the case that American Beauty is as melodrama can be kind of shown as a remake of Broken Blossoms, and obviously on the face of it that's absurd, but what's interesting about melodrama is that you can have two movies that are so different, and then they share a root structure that's kind of a rhizomatics. So I just wanted to open it there. Like, did other people find them? Did you find yourself, and I know some of you have seen American Beauty before, maybe quite a while ago, probably hadn't seen Broken Blossoms. Did American Beauty come through as a movie you quote unquote, even if you have seen it before, that you hadn't seen it before because you hadn't seen it in the context of the melodramatic structure that's so kind of brilliantly and efficiently, concisely laid out by Griffith. And I think there's problems with comparing the two, but I thought, but let's start with how could you kind of make the case of like, yeah, these are both melodramas. They're both, think of them as almost emotion machines. What are the parts? What are the moving parts where you can identify that each movie has one? And I'll tell you, let me pick on a couple. I'll pick on you, Nina, just because you're the first name up here. Do you want to just get us started with a few thoughts? They don't have to be, you don't have to work your way all the way through this. Let's just put it out there, put it on the table for others to add to.
Well, I guess right off the bat, I didn't see like obvious, overt similarities between Broken Blossoms and American Beauty. I think the one thing that sticks out to me is, again, just considering like the emotional kind of journey we take with both of them. With Broken Blossoms, it starts off where Chang Huan is kind of, looking to take the knowledge, the serenity, the Buddhist teachings, that whole experience to London. And so he starts off sort of in this place of knowing, of, if for lack of a better word, just knowing, and is hopeful about his journey and what's to come. And then goes through the whole range of emotions and ends in a place, sort of comes full circle, if you will, back to a sacred moment, back to a transcendent moment. And in the same way, I think that American Beauty starts with this, this overheard voice of Lester telling us, what he knows now. He's again in this position of knowing, of understanding, of having transcended his secular experience, and then also goes through the myriad of experiences, or takes us through, and then again ends supposedly in a transcendent space. And just another note that I had watching American Beauty for the second time in the framework of understanding it as a melodrama, like blew my mind. And I thought from the very first scene of him like putting his feet in his slippers when he wakes up, I was like, wow, like he's really dead. He's really not living.
Right.
And it's just, it totally blew my mind, and just watched him in a completely different light. And this sadness that is embedded in that acknowledgement of not really living one's life is so profound. And then the end, I felt, was like tragic, but also so heartfelt and like just so honest about, I thought, wow, way to get to a point where you're not lying to yourself anymore about what your life is. And so it's sad, but it's also triumphant. Yeah. And then my final thought, sorry to ramble.
No, this is great.
Was that I remember at the end when he's looking at the picture of his family, he has a smile on his face, and he seems to have like come full circle, but then you're like, has he really come full circle? Because he's still buying into it. He still thinks that this, thing that they've created, this life that they've built, is good, is real. And they're like, so does he really get it? I don't know, but
Mhm.
he seems to be buying into it again.
Yes, and I hopefully we'll get a little more of this tonight, and particularly with Now Voyager, which is going to be the movie we do next. It'll be our third melodrama, and we're doing a little bit of time sort of whiplash here. I jumped to 1999 from 1919, just to really emphasize how melodrama holds true over decades and decades. We'll go back to 1945, maybe I've 40 something for with Betty Davis in Now Voyager, but this is what I've been calling reinscription, which is a tricky. It's one of the trickier issues with Hollywood cinematic genre. It's the part that people don't think about. Well, depending on how much you think about the movie, but the point is these genres cannot solve the problems of the paradoxes of modernity. What they do in a manner that almost mimics a kind of secular ritual is they identify the problems unflinchingly, more so than we're usually capable of. And the reason we can tolerate it in most of these genres is it is like a riding a Ferris wheel or a roller coaster. The genre straps us in. So we look into the void, like, does anything mean anything? And it's terrifying. And then, but it seems to be within the genre itself puts up guardrails, just to mix my metaphors. So that Lester is finding his way, that Ricky Fitz seems to be a kind of prophet savant, or definitely some curious similarities to Cheng Huan. And so we're offered this reassurance is that, yes, modernity is dead. And everything we've been persuaded that everything is pointless and meaningless. And if we dare to acknowledge that without some kind of hope or structure, then we would be crushed with depression. And because there's a case to be made to someone like Carolyn, on the one hand, it's painful to watch how strenuously she denies her pain, even slapping herself when she's crying. It's really painful to watch that. But if she can't conceive of an alternative, if the only form of valuation she can literally imagine as even existing is selling that house, making that money, making more sales, being like Buddy Kane, and if that's the only thing that keeps her from certainly a crippling, if not suicidal, depression, well, then who's to begrudge her? That's one of the things that genre is so kind of careful about, is why would we dare to hope for transcendent meaning if the failure to do so would just crush us? So we see coping mechanisms in melodrama, and Gestalt therapy has a phrase they call creative adaptations, which is a little less stigmatizing than coping strategies. And the idea of the Gestalt therapists, which seems to be an interesting thing to think about with melodrama, is children come up with creative adaptations to tolerate what would otherwise be the constant, chronic, overwhelming fears and insecurities in their childhood. And we don't get a lot of backstory. We don't get any of Lester's backstory. I don't know what his parents were like or what his childhood was like. We get a bit more with Carolyn in that very charged scene where she slaps her daughter. And we've seen her slap herself. And in slapping herself, she really seems like she's taking, almost psycho-like, that she is performing the acts of her mother and she's in a dialogue with her own slapping hand, but it doesn't seem to be her hand. It seems like someone else is slapping her, even though she, of course, is slapping herself. Every time she starts to cry, she just gets slapped. And then she does the same to her daughter. And she grew up in this duplex, as she puts it. And somewhere a coping strategy that was created and adapted and allowed Carolyn to survive her childhood is now sort of eclipsing her adulthood. And as Nina pointed out, what is this what is this thing where people are so dead? And part of it is adaptations that were creative and necessary, and it protected you and allowed you to get through a childhood. dragged into adulthood, these creative adaptations become various weights around you, and that's where Carolyn is, and Ricky, certainly Ricky Fitz's father, the Marine, who's also carried in his closeted, his intensely closeted self-hatred for homosexual desire that he that he accepts because of others have told him, I think, that it's perverted, and that therefore, to the degree that he feels that he's perverted, and that, so he's not living either. And I mean, the various forms of people living, enduring a living death, it's very varied. But Battling Burroughs is not alive. The mother who dropped off Lucy's not living. The men who grab Lucy and hand them over to the father, that, you know, nobody's living. So to some degree, living melodrama is, how can we meaningfully break out of this ferocious narrowing of the only system of valuation, which is really just a coping strategy, run amok. I'll make one other. I jotted a couple things, Nina, because what you said was really interesting. But I'll just mention one more, and then maybe get some thoughts from Olivia and Riley. And Teresa is the difference between ritual and addiction is the difference between a spiral and a circle. And the difference between a spiral and a circle is the relationship to the one's return. So in a circle, when you return to where you began, you haven't gone anywhere. In a spiral, you return to from where you began, but you're not at the same level. So this might be a useful way even to think about, because you'll see these cycles in melodrama. And what I was calling in the prompt, what's the difference between a breakdown and a breakthrough? Well, this isn't the only way to put it, but a breakdown is when you come full circle back to and complete a journey that you undertook to escape from a problem, and find yourself exactly where you started. It's a little bit like that sinking feeling we've all had to a certain degree when we're lost, and we take a few turns on streets, and we think maybe, or even in the woods, and then we come to this place where, wait, I was here before. I haven't, gone forward at all. Spiral is that much more, and it's transcendent. Now, you're higher up, you're spiraling up, and we can see Lester has spiraled, he's very, very high up by the end of American Beauty, but it's sacrifice that helps make the difference between a circle and a spiral, and the problem with this self model of addiction and acquisition is that it keeps breaking down. It keeps returning after this journey that promised a breakthrough. And then at some point, I mean, you can fool yourself for a while, maybe even your whole life. But if you have a moment of insight, what James Joyce will call an epiphany, it can be a crushing moment, because all of your elaborate strategizing that you're moving toward this better place just comes crashing down. You haven't gone anywhere. So Olivia, can you jump in and think about your original thoughts before all this discussion, but then maybe connect them to what Nina's was bringing up and so on.
Yeah, so Nina brought up so many good points. Wow, I was here and I'm thinking, how do I top that? But when I'm watching the movies, I'll come back to something I said last week, which is I sort of think about if, I mean, it's easier with American Beauty because it's a modern movie. So, but thinking about the person sitting in the audience, what purpose is this serving them? And I'll sort of circle back to the original question you asked, which was similarities between Broken Blossoms and American Beauty. Did we see it? Did we not? I don't tend to look at the plot so much. Again, I'm sort of thinking about like what purpose would this be serving me as an audience member if I was going in 1919 or if I was going in 1999 to see this movie. And the plots are very different, obviously, but I think that some of the key things that stood out to me is broken family life, and the way that that plays out differently in 1919 versus 1999, but the way both films capture it very effectively. The sort of beautiful tragedy that happens in the end, like sort of it recognizes that happy endings are kind of not realistic in the real world, and they don't try and fake it and try and paint it as that there is going to be a happy ending. And both of them have that element, certainly to them. I mean, death happens at the end of both movies. So those were some thoughts I had about the similarities between the two. Again, plot's not super similar, but those ideas were. And I don't know, I really appreciate just how real, again, real's not the right word exactly, but especially with American Beauty, like it wasn't beating around the bush, trying to make it seem like life is perfect. And I think that that's sort of like, this was my first time watching the movie. And I came out of that feeling recognized, like, you know, we're in this broken world, but people are making, I'll call it a form of art. They're making forms of art that say, this is life. It's not perfect. We need to figure out ways to be okay with it. And I just think, you know, some of these movies are such brilliant ways of helping us as audience members and as just people living in post-modernity, helping us to feel okay with the state of the way things are.
Yes, good. I'm glad you brought that back into this discussion of, you know, what, because with genre, you always want to ask yourself, what is this doing for me as an audience member? What is it doing? And then that's because that's a great route to what's cinematic. Because then the next question is, and how? How is it doing that? Because it's, we all know movies. We've been watching movies forever, but when you're trying to appreciate the art of movies, we do have to make an extra effort to, these movies can be so good at being like, well, the movie is the way it is because it's the way the movie is. You know, there's kind of a seamless narrating, and it's brilliant and it carries you along. But when you're in a course, in a class, and you're thinking about it philosophically and so on, you've got to put on that other hat sometimes, not all the time. There's nothing wrong with just letting the movie wash over you the way it's trying to. And then you got to, because I do this all the time, and people sometimes think, you know, how do you even go to the movies? And you're just sitting there like making a seminar in your head. That's not true. I go and I love movies, and I've loved them since I was a kid. And I can do both. They're different. I can let the movie sort of have its way, so to speak, and then I can say, oh, that was amazing, and now let's push back and see how it did this. And because the scene with the plastic bag, for instance, is the way that's edited. You know, they are shot from the back. It's a very, very unusual. They're literally watching a movie. And so we're watching a movie of two people watching a movie. And then the editing goes back and forth between making the bag the entire screen, our screen, to cutting back to remind us that within the movie, they're watching a movie. But it's not a movie. It's not that they haven't gone to the theater. And this plastic bag, maybe some avant-garde festival, but it wouldn't garner any kind of audience. I mean, that seems to be a given. Like no one wants to watch Ricky Fitz's movies. He's got the walls lined with them. I don't even know what these hundreds of movies are. And if something, well, Ricky Fitz is just leaving. So if you were to go look at those movies, I without his guidance, I think we'd be like, why is this? You know, why did you film a garbage can? Why did you do it? And I think, to me, what I love about that scene is that Ricky Fitz is performing genre with his narration, because if you turn off the sound and watch that same scene, you wouldn't understand the effect it has on Jane. I don't think Jane would have, taken his hand and kissed him. There's some sexual attraction, but it's also a lot of she just wants to be near him. It isn't just teenagers saying, okay, now we can go to bed. The movie wouldn't be enough. I mean, if they sat there in silence, she might still kind of like him because she's intrigued by his quirkiness, but but when you watch the effect of the combination of his narration and the images on Jane, you're actually just watching what you were talking about, like how do these movies work? And when watching American Beauty, you were watching a dancing bag, and then you have a genre that's explaining to you why and how this might break the stranglehold modernity tends to have on how you can value anything. And because Ricky's a laughing stock of the whole school, and he spent 2 years drugged up in an institution. That's horrific. The brutality of this world in both these movies, the brutality toward people who dare to try and have thoughts and feelings that aren't tethered to the dominant value system. I mean, he gets beat up immediately when he tries to break up the fight with the Americans, and then he's not able to do anything further with it. But both Ricky and Cheng Huan, they're outcasts. They're seen as they're seen as threats in a way. It seems like Ricky wouldn't be, but he's a big threat. I mean, the scene where he quits his job is kind of shows how effective he is at puncturing the presumption of reality. Like the guy who hired him says, "I didn't pay you to do whatever you're doing," and he's like, "Well, then don't." It's like, "Don't what?" It's like, "Don't pay me." And you can see Lester like, my own, my entire life is passing before my eyes. But you can't forget the reinscription. I mean, what is it that allows Ricky to be like this? I mean, Lester says, "I think you just became my personal hero." I see that to a point. And without being preachy or anti-drug or anything, you really can't get around it. It's just a front. Ricky has more than enough money. He's a drug dealer, as Cheng Huan might also be. I think it's possible that he's selling opium in the shop, and that might even be what he was, one of the things he was selling to the guy who happens to drop in and then finds out that Lucy is upstairs. I've seen this movie quite a few times, and I can never quite get over in a successful melodrama, the gap between the transcendence that the movie achieves, and then trying to find that reality, that transcendence in the reality that the movie depicts. It's like falling off a cliff in a way. I mean, Lester Burnham is dead on the floor. Ricky comes by and crouches down just to watch it for a little while, and he had his video camera. He would, and where's Jane? I mean, we saw her coming down the stairs with him. Carolyn collapses into the closet. Ricky Fitz's dad is changing his bloody t-shirt. I mean, Lester can bob around in heaven like some kind of soap bubble, but it's kind of an unholy mess down there of what's going to happen next. And that's where the movie can give you a little bit of whiplash. Like if you follow the trajectory of the movie, you sweep up with Lester, and it's beautiful, and it's inviting transformation. And I think when people say, yeah, and that's why I don't like melodrama, because they do that. They trick you. They give you this transcendent ride, and it's so effective that you just forget all the inconsistencies in the movie. And melodrama even has a reputation for being unrealistic. But I think that's because it's psychologically so realistic that it's not, it doesn't care. Like film noir, it often is more in that sense is the consequences of actions are almost they're tediously carried out. Like nobody gets away with anything in film noir. But so all of that to riff on your point about what happens to the audience. And there are, there's not literally a movie within a movie in Broken Blossoms, but it is possible to go back and look at the use of Griffith's use of windows, where the point of view shots when he first sees Lucy, the square of the window, she looks like she's on a movie screen, and again we're getting that double implication that we're watching Lucy and Cheng Huan's watching Lucy, and the screen, her face, the close-up is the entire screen. And there's a kind of something Kubrick will go to town with in 2001, but that cinema may be the closest thing to secular transcendence. And we know that. We talk about the dream palace of Hollywood, the silver screen, and we know it's kind of magical. We don't know exactly why. And it's just interesting that an art form driven by a machine is able to generate the feelings of transcendence, even within what it's one of the sociologists called the iron cage of modernity, the way that it doesn't let you breathe. Like that shot of Lester sitting at his desk, that great wide open shot where there's all the other, almost like the shot in the Matrix where he sees everybody else in their vat. I mean, they're all kind of trapped and dead in their different ways. Yeah, so let's see if we can get some more as we move along. Riley, how about you? What do you want to add to this?
Yeah, you guys have all made some amazing points, and the only thing that I can think about, I'm just trying to deal with this little bit of time whiplash here. In terms of going all through time, I just find it amazing that both films can kind of tackle this idea of the search for beauty and kind of using love as a way to look for it, with Cheng Huan and his love for Lucy and kind of finding it that way. And then Lester kind of at the end through his realization of the beauty for kind of the things that he didn't really appreciate before. Mm-hmm. I just think that it's amazing that no matter what, the search for beauty is a constant, like all throughout history, pretty much.
Yeah, and that does take us back to the multiple definitions of beauty, because Angela has been persuaded that she's beautiful, and what she understands that to be is that she's sexually attractive, because she's confused when he sits back after and says, well, we're not going to have sex. And she said, but you said I was beautiful, and then he's like, you are, and that's a really interesting moment, because then we see the multi-layered, how much the word beauty is standing in for, because beauty can be crass in a way, like you can just want to take something and gratify yourself, and you can call that beautiful. But when she says, I thought, but you said I was beautiful, and he says you are, he's actually close to this definition of beauty as the sublime, something that is aesthetic theory has looked at, like what's the difference between the beautiful and the sublime. Immanuel Kant and other philosophers have tried to figure this out, like what's the difference between looking at a rose and saying, oh, that rose is beautiful, but that isn't a sublime moment. Or you can watch a sunset and you can say it's beautiful, and then that same sunset could operate as sublime, but what's the difference? The difference seems to be the effect it has on you. So depending on where I am in my life or in my moods, I look at a rose, and Riley, Nina, Olivia, you look at a rose, and I might be like, oh, that's a beautiful rose. You might be in a different place. Things may have happened in the previous week where it's more than that. And what is that more than that? Because you won't, by definition, you can't articulate it. And to use these Lacanian terms I use sometimes, the difference between the beautiful, when you say, oh, what a beautiful rose, is that's a reality. But beyond that, reality is a real, is a thing that allows there to be reality. So that's the same rose can either merely be beautiful within your reality, or can be sublime because it seems to have arrived from something outside your reality. And yet at the same time, it's in your reality. And that's where the sublime and the sacred can be seen in tandem, where an object that is just a cup can also be the chalice in the Catholic Mass. If an object can simultaneously be what it is and appear to have come from an elsewhere beyond reality, then what you get is an intrusion of the real into reality. That's the sublime moment. It's a very it's an incredibly charged moment, and it isn't necessarily going to be fun. And the more honest melodramas, I think, in American Beauty with I think both these are a case in point. They don't pander to that. They don't clean up the moment where the real enters reality, because it's an electrifying, it's a scorching moment, and it can burn you. It can crush you. It seems to be crushing Carolyn every time that it intrudes on her reality. But by the end of the movie, Lester is somehow given the resilience to tolerate the intrusion of the larger real into his reality. And only then does he say, I was able to appreciate every moment of my stupid little life. So, on the one hand, what's not pleasant about the real intruding on your reality, if you're not ready for it, is it can make your life, it can make you wonder, what's the point of my stupid little life? Or it can do that, but it gives you such a larger context that it's okay. And you see Ricky also talking about, Ricky, basically he uses his video as a conduit to the real. That seems to be what gets him to turn on the camera, like a dead bird, or a woman who died, who's a homeless woman who died of the cold. He's looking for the real in reality, and that's the way Lucy gets positioned for Cheng Huan. And Griffiths has several title cards. It says he saw in her a beauty that no one else saw. So that's kind of trying to illustrate what I've just been saying, that the same object, no one else seems to pay a lot of attention to Lucy. Evil Eye has noticed her, and he might even say she's quote unquote beautiful, but more in the sense of, I could pimp her, I could get people to pay for that sexual beauty. And that, obviously, that's the danger that Angela is beginning to fall into. And Lester, to the extent that he sort of saves himself by not following through with the sexual act, which she's still willing to go through with, but he can no longer, fortunately, I think, could persuade himself that it's in her best interest, even if she's still trying to follow through on my worth is how I'm attractive to men. And Ricky just told me I'm, ordinary, and I know it, and I'm kind of crushed. And so I gotta go to the next level with my being attracted to men. And that's, so I'm here. And so this is all right. And so I still want to do it, quote unquote. But it's not what she needs. It's remarkable how this moment where he turns from investment to sacrificing his sexual gratification, frees her up to get something she wasn't looking for. She gets an acknowledgement of her worth that is not about her sexuality. And to be fair, Lester, up until this point, had only been viewing her sexually, really. And suddenly he sees, and he at that moment where he gets the blanket, and having unbuttoned the shirt, which he's been fantasizing about for weeks and months or whatever, and then he gets this blanket and wraps her up again, and it's such an interesting, and he becomes a dad all of a sudden, and and I love the way that they each inadvertently give to each other the thing they're not looking for, which is what they need in that moment. Because so often when we go with investing, we get the thing we demand, but it's not what we need. How do you get what you need, and not simply well, to put this a different way, Lester feels like he needs to work out, be sexy, have Angela confirm all that. Angela feels like she has to take the next step toward seeing that she's attracted to men. That's what they both think they need. But what is inside the need? And this is what melodrama looks for. And what's inside something that makes it sublime and not beautiful? What is the implicit demand buried inside your need that even you don't know? Because we see this again and again in melodrama. People pursue what they think they need. And Carolyn never pulls out of it. Carolyn never can figure out what is the ask? What is she asking for? The scene with the Italian couch is also kind of poignant. And I mean, it's for her especially, I think. It's super sad. When she's broken the moment, that's, in fact, in the whole movie, that may be the closest she gets to a breakthrough, but she keeps it at the level of breakdown. Because instead of continuing to be angry, like you almost spilled beer on our $4,000 couch, she hears herself. And he said, this is nothing. This is just stuff. And for a moment, she hears him. And I think for half a second, she's like, where am I? Who am I? What am I doing here? But she has no support. And she can't stay. She can't stay in that vulnerable, exposed moment. And yeah, okay. So that's Riley, that's good. Teresa, let's jump in. I want to see if I can hear from everybody tonight. What do you want to add or question about all this?
Right. So I actually have a lot of thoughts after rewatching American Beauty. And then I think both Broken Blossom and American Beauty convey this idea that we are fundamentally alone, despite we may or may not establish connections with others. So the characters from both films, they all suffer from the inability to form a meaningful bond with people in their lives. So, when this one character begins to convey this idea or feeling, it just cannot be completed. And so I think for Ricky and Jane, though, the case might be a bit different because they actually understand each other. This is actually a parallel for Chen Huan and Lucy's case, just like you mentioned, that, Chen Huan realized her beauty, which was a bit ridiculous to me because the actress was conspicuously gorgeous. But I think more importantly is that how Ricky and Jane come to really appreciate each other. And also for the monologue in the ending, maybe you don't know what I'm talking about, but one day you will. So this scene almost moved me to tears this time. It really surprised me because this time I actually did know and understand because I felt it so strongly. So it also ties together with the idea of sacrifice that you mentioned last week, which was something I couldn't understand when I first watched it years ago. So now merging it with the idea of sacrifice, I felt that Lester, this character, he has to die as a sacrifice to really encourage people to come to some sort of realization about life itself. So yeah, overall this time I felt a lot of strong emotions, especially rewatching American Beauty this time.
Yeah, I like to connect what you just said to something I heard Olivia talking about. If you would ask the question, why does Lester have to die? And he has to die for us. He doesn't have to die for Jane or Carolyn, or he doesn't have to die for anybody that's in the movie. Nobody needs him to die. He has to die for us, and that's where this is almost like, wow, am I at a Catholic mass, and this is the moment of communion. This is where Christ sacrificed himself. Why did Christ have to die? And believe me, there's thousands of books that wonder about that. Christ himself, kind of the night before, was sort of like, do I have to go through with this, God? And got no answer, and went through it. Why did Christ have to die? Because only being willing to die for a principle, and now willing to die isn't quite, he gets shot in the back of the head. He's not expecting it, but we do get to hear his commentary on it after he's seen it. And it's another weird example where this whole movie we're watching with the dead Lester from the beyond. I mean, he introduces it. It's presumably every single scene he's going over things, just like he does inside the movie, going over the photographs. But Teresa, I think you brought home very nicely that. And someone, I think earlier, Nina was also mentioning that this movie doesn't pull its punches, and neither does Broken Blossoms. They go through with it. That you could have had a lesser melodrama by Lucy being like, it's just a flesh wound or something else, but it would, as melodrama, as a kind of secular ritual, seeking the sacred and resisting the addictive and exposing the hurtful narrowness of how we come to value things. Sacrifice has always been associated with death. I mean, that's the ultimate sacrifice. Now, maybe you can have lesser sacrifices, but it always involves giving up something you'll never get back. And I love that I do love that last line, and that brilliant directing decision to go to all black. We lose the movie entirely, and we're in the dark. It's a great meta audience moment. We no longer have the images, the beautiful girl, the roses to help distract us. He's like, you don't know what I'm talking about, but don't worry, someday. And then the screen goes black. So where the hell did that voice come from? That's funny. He says, you will. I mean, it just seems biblical. And it's such a great awareness of, one of the most emotive moments in watching a movie is when the movie stops, because we get caught up in what's next. And the older movies often say the end, the word. And we sometimes that's a bit of a gut punch, because everything we'd been kind of not feeling yet because we hadn't seen everything yet. And now it's over. I mean, in a sense, the movie dies too. And in this, it can only continue to live in how you react to it. So the opening of a movie and the end of a movie are such interesting moments, because when a movie opens, we scramble to orient ourselves. And then we work the whole movie with the help of the movie to become oriented. But then the movie stops. And we have the experience of having fought hard to get oriented through the course of the movie. But suddenly it's almost like our consciousness splits in half. Now we have that experience of having gotten oriented and been oriented by the movie. But we're not in the movie. We're not living in the movie. We have to go back to our car. We have to drive back home. We have to talk to maybe whoever we went to the movie with. And that can be, in really powerful movies, and certainly powerful theater, that can be difficult at sometimes. A lot of what we call date movies try and make sure that they don't end on an awkward moment, so that you can talk about them. And I wouldn't call American Beauty a date movie, I mean, except unless you're dating Ricky Fitz or someone more like that. Ricky Fitz is sort of, I think, what a lot of high school, a lot of high school guys are going to see Ricky Fitz as a personal hero, because he stays with his idiosyncrasies, and it's those idiosyncrasies that make him attractive to a girl. And instead of, he doesn't do any of the things you should do in high school. He's not on sports. He makes zero effort, and nobody wants anything to do with him. And he stays true to what he's pursuing, which takes me back to a word that Teresa, you brought up, you started with, in fact, and that's this issue of being alone. What are the various iterations of alone that we see in melodrama? Because there, you can feel more alone with someone than you can feel with just yourself. So alone isn't about who's in the room. It's about a shared sense of interconnection or complete lack. In fact, there's nothing lonelier than being in a crowded room and feeling no connection to anything going on around you. Lonely people are often alone because it's easier to be lonely alone than to be lonely in a crowd. That's really painful. So lonely people, oddly enough, don't go to parties, and they may be right to a certain extent. They certainly don't want to go to superficial parties, but there's a gap builds up where you get alone, and then your tolerance for chit chat and it becomes less and less, and then you want too much connection too fast, and that puts off other people. That TMI, or too much information, you just sort of blurt out everything you've been thinking, and the person's like, I just was in here for a frappuccino, and as they back out the door. There's an art to how quickly you disclose, and in a way, Ricky knows it. I mean, he doesn't go after Jane, but he is. The honesty of his interest in her is kind of refreshing, right? He just says, "You're interesting," and then lights her name in fire on the lawn, the way you do when somebody interests you. But I also, he doesn't see Angela, so which is really confusing to Angela. After the conversation, where Jane's like, "What are you doing? I don't like you filming me," and all this stuff, and then Angela said, "He's such a weirdo. He didn't even look at me." And then later, when Jane looks at the lawn and then looks across and says, "Oh, he's filming us now," I think she says, "Oh, good, I'm in my element." Teenage boy, video camera, filming into a girl's bedroom. I know how to become the center of this. And then in brilliant editing, she goes to the front of the window and is doing this kind of cheerleader, sexy little hip move, and she's completely out of focus, because and there's a mirror to her left that has Jane's face, and then he hits the zoom, and again we're seeing cinema in action here in a way, and he just wants he wants to see Jane's face. He did zero interest in Angela's physically very attractive body, but what Ricky's attracted to is people who have some authentic connection to themselves. And poor Angela, I think maybe this is getting better at the very end, but she's completely cut off from any sense of authenticity. Jane is hanging in there. I mean, I think she's, one of when her dad, when Lester says to her, you guys, you couldn't care less, could you? And he addresses the comment both to his wife and to his daughter. But it's Jane who says, "Well, why? What do you expect? You've barely spoken to me in months." And that's actually an interesting, authentic moment. And the kind of the way that Carolyn wants Jane to not like her father and to see her as the good person, that comes up a lot, and it's kind of devastating to the mother when Jane's like, the two of you, I can't watch this anymore. She's like, me, because she's gotten in her own mind, she's so convinced that she's the parent model that Jane can look up to. But Jane's doing something much more difficult. She's at that point of saying, wow, there are serious problems with both my parents, and there's serious problems with the way they relate. And that's part of what she says to Ricky, like when the opening. I mean, there's another interesting loop in this movie where we open with a scene that will get repeated halfway through, and that's we have Jane is on screen or on Ricky's video saying, I need a role model, not my dad who wants to get with any girlfriend I bring home. You know, like, how can someone should put him out of his misery. And Ricky says, do you want me to kill him for you? And she says, yes, would you? Now, what's funny about this is that if this were a film noir, that would have been a real situation. I mean, film noir is full of wives wanting to get rid of a husband and keep the insurance and duping some guy who's attracted to them into performing the murder. That's the plot of Double Indemnity and you know, at least half a dozen other noirs. So we open with a noir. It's a kind of grainy, black and white plot to a murder. It's only the second time that gets replayed halfway through the movie that she adds, you know, I'm kidding, right? And he says, sure. And by then we see the wider context. But Jane is to me is a really interesting character of how do you move from assuming your parents are, you know, perfect, and not only discovering that they're not, to wondering how this has affected you. And you know, Carolyn never was able to do that, because when she talks about her recollection of living in the duplex with her mother, there's no separation there between her recollection of this memory and who she sees herself as now. She's still in that duplex, no matter how many houses she tries to sell. And you can almost read her trying to clean that house into a re-traumatization. Like, this is I'm going to change, I'm going to convert my duplex into something of value. And because she keeps saying, today I will sell this house, today I will sell this house. And she walks around and it's at the end, she has her biggest, really one of her biggest breakdowns in the movie, because she's been brought back to the same place, that she's asking the wrong questions. She wants the wrong thing. She's, you know, no one can fault Carolyn for effort. I mean, the amount of work and energy she puts in to trying to get out of her jam is you know, is enormous. So thank you for that, Teresa. Victoria, what do you think? What have we covered? Did you have a favorite scene or moment or idea about melodrama that's maybe not getting the same emphasis?
I don't know. One thing that kind of stuck out to me was the portrayal of women in both films.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I don't know if anyone else got this, but I thought that in both movies, they were kind of shown as like weak and needing like male validation. And yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I just think that like the male characters, even though they were going through things too, especially in the movie we just watched,
Mm-hmm.
They kind of had like a power over the women in the movies.
Mm-hmm.
And I just found it interesting that that's like the main connection I kind of put together between the two.
Yeah, let's stick with that for a moment, because I think that may be another example of this difficult phenomenon that I'm trying to explain to you guys, that I'm calling reinscription. Because in both cases, and in virtually all melodramas, there's a crisis in patriarchy. Battling Burroughs is a hopeless. Lester is also, until the end of the movie, perhaps a failure as a father. So there, and what the melodrama tries to do is say this breakdown of patriarchy is a good thing, because patriarchy is objectifies women, sexualizes women, treats them as objects, and we have to. And Lester needs to let go of this of patriarchy in that sense. But is there a reinscription here? Does Lester sneak back into the patriarchy through a back door, so to speak? Because if I'm hearing what you're saying a little bit, Victoria, that you know so he doesn't have sex with Angela. So clearly Angela's not a sex object. but she then moves on to becoming a sacred object, and that would seem to be better. I think it is better in a certain way, but there's still an objectification. It kind of reminds me of when Dorian Gray says, "I'll go back to Sybil Vane and I'll marry her, and now she'll keep me pure." And it's like, wait, you're still, positioning her. You're assigning the woman emotional work, which is a major hallmark of patriarchy, where patriarchy is not just objectifying women sexually, it's also wanting women to do the emotional heavy lifting of the relationship, whether it's a marriage. And some of the strain that you see the women come into, and I mentioned this in one of my replies to one of your notes this morning. If you watch Carolyn's hairdo, it's a very odd. It's a certain extent. It's a late '90s hairdo, I guess, but it's almost a parody of an elaborate hairdo. It's layered, it's brushed certain ways, and in her earlier photographs, she just has a simple bob, and it's almost like this. The one thing melodrama will do is it'll pick something like a hairdo, and we'll take it. The hairdo will be registering the movement of the melodramatic force. So, like, she gets caught in the rain, and then the hairdo is gone, and it's kind of another invitation to let go of your hairstyle, let go of your, because clearly this is a hairstyle that she wants it to stay in place, and just like her gloves match her gardening shears or whatever it is that Lester points out. This she coordinates her outfits because she feels so uncoordinated inside, and so I don't know. Am I drawing out what you were talking about, Victoria, or am I dragging it off to my own points, or what do you think?
Yeah, what you were saying is like what I was thinking as well.
Okay. In which regard? Just the idea that does reinscription make a little sense in trying to talk about, how can this movie have it both ways, which is the patriarchy, because Ricky Fitz's father is destroyed by his parody of male heterosexuality, his fetishization of the Nazis, of being a Marine, of having been in the army, his watching these old army movies from giving his wife absolutely no emotional connection whatsoever, until she seems like a lonely moon that is circling this. I find her depiction unsettling and horrifying every time I see the movie, and she's not even. It's hard to see her as a main. She's a brilliant actress, and I've seen her in many other things. She used to play the press secretary on that White House show, where she was incredibly vibrant, just like nothing. Like, it just shows her amazing range as an actress. But she is so haunting, the way she's sitting at the table when Ricky comes in with Jane, and he has to come around, and then she says, "I want to apologize." Then we get the point of view shots from there's nothing out of place. And it's like she's entombed in the most obvious way. So I think, Victoria, this will be you might get even more a more nuanced way to talk about this when you see now Voyager, which is 1945, because we're going to watch Bette Davis playing the daughter of an extremely controlling matriarch. Her father died some time ago, so the father's absent. The mother's dominating. Bette Davis, in the opening of the movie, she's very much kind of a milquetoast. She's been thoroughly defeated by her mother on every level. And then the movie's, and she's having a breakdown, a nervous breakdown. The movie will open with a kindly sister-in-law having contrived to bring a psychiatrist into the house against the will of the mother, because she's worried about how Bette Davis's Charlotte, as her name is, becoming more and more of a recluse. She won't leave her room, and the psychiatrist brings in this kind of very unwelcome breath of fresh air, and you see him and the mother square off relative to Charlotte. And then the rest of the movie is going to be like, how can Charlotte also get out from the planetary pull of her mother? But it's going to, in some ways, now Voyager's anti-patriarchal, but it has, and I don't want to do spoilers here, but it has a very contrived way, like how, ask yourself when you're watching now Voyager, how does Charlotte manage to have a man who adores her and a child she can love, and somehow also skip marriage? Because remember the way Lucy was, you can't be a prostitute and you can't get married. And Charlotte almost gets married to an appropriate suitor whom she doesn't have any feelings for. And she backs out at the last minute because she feels like it's a disservice to him, but also to herself. And then her mother's furious because this guy was a proper Boston Brahmin. And she can't believe that Charlotte broke the engagement. But the man she really loves is married. And although he seems to have a very shrewish wife, it's part of his principles that he won't divorce her. And then he also has a troubled daughter. So how are they going to put together a family? And it's a little like Cheng Huan and Lucy in a weird way, like that. What makes their relationship transcendent is it being sexual would be wrong. I mean, he's married. The daughter looks up to Charlotte. If she were to find out that Charlotte was her father's lover, it would be very destructive to her. But it also sets up enough. It sets up the possibility for sacrifice. Now Voyager, probably more than these first two movies, is really good at creating this incredible traction with sacrifice, and the importance, how renouncing immediate gratification, again depicted as sexual, can open the way to so much more meaning. So immediate gratification is the enemy of significance, because it rushes you to a similar resolution of your tensions. It doesn't give you a chance to understand yourself. Like, what are you willing to give things up for? Because it seems that giving up things that we otherwise could choose to have is a crucial dimension of significance. Like, it's very hard to know what's significant if you don't think about what you'd be willing to give up to preserve it, to establish it. And I know you guys, you guys work really hard toward your careers, and I've talked about grade point average, and there's a degree of, people often talk about sacrifice, and I think that's fair to a point, but it's also an investment, and it's a question we can ask ourselves all the time. What's the ratio of sacrifice to investment in the things you're doing in your life? And I don't expect you to answer this, but it can be really useful, because first of all, they mimic investing mimics sacrifice so effectively that if you're not careful, you can get into this death and life scenario where you feel like you must be sacrificing because you get up at 5 a.m. every day to do something. But is it what you want to do? What's the, because investing protects you from being concerned about the quality of what you're spending your time doing, because it always points to something that's accumulating, and you can mistake the accumulation for an increase in insight or an increase in self-perception. I think the way I put it in one of my notes too is there's a difference between redemption and rearrangement, and somewhere between redemption and rearrangement is also this phenomenon of the reinscription. Carolyn keeps seeking redemption through rearrangement. Rearrangement can also mimic redemption. Like, I'm going to start a diet, I'm going to start jogging, I'm going to stop drinking, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. I'm not going to see this person anymore. I'm going to see more of that person. There's nothing wrong with all these things unless you're just rearranging. Because actual redemption, and I don't mean this necessarily religiously, but that kind of transcendence is going to be painful. It's going to be disorienting. There's an element of it that will be frightening. And what modernity encourages us to believe is we can get redemption through rearrangement. When I haven't figured out how to work this into my Pepsi myths, but one of the common threads I see in so many ads is, we will give you redemption, and then they offer you rearrangement. So even these cosmetic ads that we talk about so much, it's like, you need a new hairstyle, you need a new color of lipstick, that will take you to the next level. But it's flatlined. It's a circle that comes back to where you were when you began. So you cannot have the spiral unless part of the element of your journey is giving up things you would have rather not, because that's the only way to return to from where you began and know it in a way that you didn't know when you first left it. Okay, so I'm just backing up. Jacob, you may have joined us later, but how would you jump into this discussion? If you're out there, Jacob.
Yeah, hi. I
Hi.
kind of just joined the course today, so I haven't seen
Well,
the
you're
movie.
perfect. We want to hear from you. How are you surviving?
Am I surviving?
Having been dropped into this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of confusing. Like, I don't know, just I'm hearing a bunch of things.
Yep.
Kind of, to be honest, kind of dozing off a bit. I don't know.
Yeah, that's not as exhilarating as one would imagine. Well, where have you gotten so far in the course? Have you been able to see one or both movies and so on?
I kind of just literally when I first went onto the website, I saw, oh, there's something at 7, I guess, so I just joined it. So I briefly read what movies I need to watch, so I
yeah, it's in a way, boredom is it's an effective strategy to survive what would otherwise be complete incoherence. So what a lot of people might, when they walk up to a Jackson Pollock, they just be like, oh my God, because it would take so much to involve yourself. But do bear with it. I don't always know what happens when you reverse engineer the lectures and the discussions and take them back to the movies, but I think it can work. And it's and I do encourage this back and forth movement, where you go back to earlier prompts, you go back to thinking about an earlier movie, and in a way, to do this, can you spiral in this class, would be another way to put it. I mean, that's part of what I'm trying to do tonight in a funny way, is you've watched another melodrama. Have you come full circle and are unchanged? Or can you come full circle and recognize that you have, but also feel like now you're kind of up here? And can you do that again after you see now Voyager? And then one final time with Todd Haynes' Safe, which is a very postmodern melodrama. I won't even try and describe it yet, but I haven't taught. I could have ended with a Cirque melodrama, but I felt like, okay, if I'm really going to take this to one last level, I got to do this. I got to do a movie like Safe. It's a risk on my part, because you may be like, what the hell was that? I was just starting to think he was making sense. And now this movie, how is this a melodrama? How is it not? So, but that's our fourth one. We'll see if you can do. The way that Safe flirts with horror, it's melodrama, but there's a horrific strain. And I think, going back to Victoria's concern, it will be the most involved and layered look at what does it feel to get objectified as a woman? Because we haven't really seen that very much yet at all. I mean, even with Angela, I mean, he says to how are you doing? And when they're in the kitchen, she goes, I still feel weirded out. We don't really, we're not inside. Safe is going to show that a woman who's been Julianne Moore is the actress. She's been objectified since she can remember as beautiful and sexy, but it's not how she feels. That's how she gets seen and positioned. And it's what gets nightmarish about the movie in a way is you can't find a way to figure out what she thinks. You see her struggling, and sometimes it's just easier to collapse back into being what other people see. And that's when you look at gender construction in the movies, and I think Victoria has broached this effectively, is that for the woman, it is so hard to figure out who you are other than what other people see, because women are used as placeholders for so many things, as innocent virgins or sexually available, or there's this relentless projecting onto women of everybody acting like they know who you are. And it can be, and because it's done with a lot of urgency, it can be really confusing. And how do you get from being a girl to being a woman? How do you go through that that kind of that hallway of everybody telling you what's happening to you, everybody interpreting what you're trying to figure out? Whereas going from boy to man, the expectations are a lot more generic. And masculinity, the way culture constructs it, is not a placeholder. It's the thing from which other placeholders get their meaning and their value. It's what Lacan calls the phallic signifier. It's like the perfect masculine, and there's no such thing, is to be a master signifier, is to come off. It's something that Trump kind of grotesquely, in my view, imitates, where he is the original signifier. There's no everything signifies in relation to Trump. He himself does not signify in relation to anything. It's what we see with the Wizard of Oz, where, at least the first part of the movie, where he's the master signifier. Everybody makes sense of their lives by assuming that there's nothing behind him. There's nothing that signifies him. He is the thing that allows us to signify. Roughly speaking, patriarchy, in order to position men as master signifiers, position women as only being something of significance in relation to men. You can see this with the male gaze, that so-called male gaze in cinema, that how often are the men looking at the women? How often are the women looking at the men? Women look at men in film noir because they're femme fatales, and they're depicted as treacherous, sexually available, but murderous. I mean, they're really frightening to men because they look back. They have their own desire. They have their own plan. They have a plan that is effectively manipulating the man. And Vertigo is a kind of example of some of this. And the ultimate nightmare for the man is that the woman he's used to position himself in order to feel significant is actually moving him around. There's a great line in Body Heat, which is kind of called a neo-noir because it's from the 80s. And when the femme fatale first meets this not super bright lawyer that she promptly sets up to be the fall guy for a murder, she says, "You're not very bright, are you? I like that in a man." And it's kind of the femme fatale in a single line. I can't believe she's saying it out loud, but she's kind of like, I'm attractive, you're dumb, this could work. And she says it right to his face. And he's just like, I'm just delighted. I'm so glad you're paying attention to me. So I guess in a way I'm circling back to what Lucy and Angela are really there's so many ways to do this, but from a kind of feminist gender construction point of view, they show, and there's again a reinscription here. The first part of the movie, they are simply objects for men. You know, Lucy gets moved around by her father, by her absent mother, by Evil Eye. In fact, the only one who's not moving her around in the first part of the movie is Chang Huan, and Angela also is no more than an object for other people's gaze. And then with the melodrama, and remember, this is associated with being a woman's genre. It tries to, and once again gets caught up in reinscription, it tries to give the women agency, and seems to a degree, like, and but then you have to look, does it? You know, there's points in Broken Blossoms where we're allowed to see that Lucy is coming into a sense that she has value, in an intrinsic value, something her father never let her feel, but it doesn't spare her. And with Angela, you know, and you guys might have I'm wondering what's next for Angela in a funny way in this movie. We could wonder what's next for Carolyn, but Angela's almost more, well, she is more important. And when you look at those series of vignettes where we get an aerial view of each room when the same gunshot is heard, that's a brilliant visualization of melodrama, because melodrama takes a single thing, a gunshot, and then it invites you to locate yourself in relation to it. So each character has a moment of self-awareness brought on by the gunshot. We don't know, you know, they're wondering what was that? I mean, they may not even be clear it's a gunshot. Angela's is, to me, was really interesting because she's in the bathroom looking in the mirror. But the impression I got is that she's looking in a mirror in a way she never has before, because she's not primping, she's not trying to imagine what a man would see when he looks at her. She's actually seeing herself. And there are a lot of mirrors in American Beauty. Carolyn can't see herself in the mirror. She sees her speck of dust in the mirror and rubs on the speck of dust and is essentially rubbing out her own face in that scene where she's trying to clean the mirror in the terrible house she's trying to sell. So on a strictly visual level, I was slightly encouraged that Angela seems more present to herself in her 2-second vignette, but it's hard to know because we're going to get swept up into the heavens with Lester, which is kind of amazing. But and here's where, going back to Olivia's point about what am I doing in the audience? What am I being invited to do in the audience? Lester is gone, and his final comment is, "You don't understand, but you will." So we are like those other characters that are here, the gunshot, and arguably the last sentence of this movie is a gunshot for every single person in the audience, and there's almost a shot. Well, we go right to black, almost like the pulling of a trigger, like boom, it's gone, just the shooting of a gun. So where are you in the dark? Are you, and of all the characters that were shown, I mean, Ricky and Jane, I like the point one of you guys made, that there's something very compelling about their relationship because they care so much about how each one is dealing with these issues of value and authenticity. And they're obviously, there's sexual attraction and they're lovers, but it doesn't just present that as the only thing. And that the scene where she turns the camera on him and says, "How do you feel?" And he's like, "I don't know." And she said, "Don't you feel naked?" And he says, "I am naked." and in a way, that's the perfect, Ricky Fitz, just being what he is. But the movie is a lot about vulnerability in that sense of nakedness. Clearly, Angela immediately feels super self-conscious when Lester sits back and realizes this doesn't pursue her anymore, and suddenly she's has her shirt unbuttoned, and Lester, to his credit, immediately takes charge of that in a way, and wraps her in the towel or the bathrobe. But there's another curious moment with Angela, which I thought bodes well for Angela in a way, and that is she turns the camera on Lester in a way and says, "How are you?" Which really came out of nowhere. That's the first time I felt Angela said anything that came out of her own curiosity. Like she's talking back to the male gaze finally, and saying, you know, who are you? How are you? What are you? And no longer just saying you're something I have to perform for. And the more I can, capture, make you attracted to me, the more I can convince myself that I have value. But it isn't an internal value. It's a performative value. So when she says, "How are you?" and he really pauses on that, you know, he says nothing, and then he says, "It's been a really long time since anybody's asked me that," and he thinks even more, and then he says, I'm good. And it's funny that now that he didn't get this thing, that he changed his entire life to make good on Angela's overheard promise that she'd have sex with him. And then he doesn't, and now that's finally what presents him with his breakthrough. What if Angela hadn't said that? What if she continued to play the sexy available girl? Then Lester'd be nowhere in an interesting way. So that, and somehow Ricky and Jane do this naturally for each other. It's not easy to show up for the other person. It's not easy to be who you are, whether they like it or not, whether they know it or not, whether they want it or not, whether they care about it or not. And that's the other problem with moving from soul to self, is the self is performative and the soul is demonstrative. You're supposed to try and radiate what the soul has implanted in you. So it's not about performing for the gaze. It's about being somehow who you are, and then the look will see you doing that. But because the difference between a look and a gaze is a look that presumes to know you, and that's what we see in the bleachers. Yeah, he's gazing at Angela, and the movie does a pretty good job of saying that when you're gazing at someone, you're not seeing them. You're seeing what you want to see for your own reasons. I mean, there's no way Angela is winking at him and tipping her hat to him and doing all these things he's seeing her doing in that in that bleacher scene. So the gaze, ironically, and it's often presented as masterful, but the gaze is blind. People who gaze are blind because they are only seeing through, they are projecting their desire. And so what they're seeing is a reflection of what they fantasize having to complete themselves. And the other person is simply not there. And again, women are subjected to this gaze so much through ads, through real life. It's a lot of effort for a woman to talk back to the male gaze. And in many cases, you won't get an answer. Angela does actually get an answer. He hears her question. Most from the perspective of the cultural construction of masculinity, being asked how you are is a threatening question, because you're not supposed to, there's not supposed to be any valence to how you are. You're just supposed to be. So the very fact that, you know, are you all right, or how are you? These questions are immediately batted down by, in cultural terms, by quote unquote men. I'm fine, you know, don't worry about it. Carolyn's attempt to talk back to the gaze is to mimic that masculine attitude of this, you know, stop it, don't cry, don't have these feelings, invalidate these feelings. Another way to say that Ricky and Jane are kind of an attractive model is their relationship to each other is not dictated by gender performance, or at least not to the same extent. I mean, he doesn't pose for her. In the one scene where she does, quote unquote, pose for him, where she goes to the window and takes her shirt off, it's whether I think the women could tell me whether this works or not. I don't know. I wouldn't presume to know. It seemed different than Angela, because it seemed to me that she was saying, I want you to look at me. I like you. You find me interesting. I want you to see me. Versus when Angela is doing her little dance in front of the window, which is, I want you to see what you want to see, or want me to be. So paying attention to the male gaze and to feminine performance in the melodrama, and this will be true in now Voyager. How does, and this may be why melodrama was an attractive genre to women in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s. It whether it succeeds or not, and ultimately I think through reinscription it does it, because these melodramas can't correct the male gaze in patriarchal culture that we all live in, but it can give women a sort of a genre, a guidance through it. Wouldn't it be great if it could? And what if women could have the gaze? What if women could feel their own agency? What if women could act out of their needs without having to first see how they can integrate that to what other people need to see? So you will see Bette Davis's Charlotte's character will find her voice. She will find agency. She will become confident. It's very, very clear. But when we have our discussion a week from tonight, where is the reinscription happening? In what way is this rearrangement and not necessarily redemption, even though it feels like redemption? I can't remember now if I got to everyone, but I'm conscious of the time. And who wants to jump back in to either to reprise something they've said now that we've had our discussion, or jump in and say something new or something we haven't done? Yeah, Nina.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something about Ricky, who I find is just he's a very interesting character. And I thought that he kind of has this edge about making everyone around him uncomfortable.
Yes.
And he's also, I thought he was actually probably the only character who was really comfortable with the brushing up of with their authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like maybe so he was probably the most authentic character. And, I think because of his experience of being confronted with his parents and how much they reject those, brushes with their authenticity, like his father being so homophobic and just very strict in his male roles, and the whole that role that he's performing, and then his mother, who is just, like you said, like a zombie. She's so indoctrinated and so steeped in her role. And then I thought it was interesting that when he's leaving his home and he's been kicked out by his dad, he's saying goodbye to his mother and he says, "Take care of dad." And I was like, she's the one who needs taking care of. But it's probably because he recognizes that his father is so far gone, and if anybody needs help, it's him.
And he's right.
Maybe there's
yeah.
So I thought that Ricky, he makes everybody uncomfortable, but he's probably the most honest character. He's probably the most present.
Yes, and in some ways he parallels what Cheng Huan tries to channel as well, which is one way to make people uncomfortable, whether you mean to or not, is if you maintain your connection to the elsewhere that gives your life meaning, whether it's convenient or not to other people, because we don't always realize we're all really opinionated in lots of times about how it is we see our life as significant, and you can really bump into when somebody just has their own elsewhere, and it's like that employer where he says, well, then don't pay me, I quit so you don't have to pay me, and he just says, just curses at him and goes back. He literally doesn't have the vocabulary to answer this kid. But you reminded me of a scene I meant to bring up because it seemed really different and interesting. And why does Ricky, and maybe I'll pose this as a question in case someone out there has an answer. Why does Ricky confirm what isn't true when his father says, I'll throw you out of the house and never see you again if you're servicing men, which is all his own. And when we've seen what he saw, we see that he sees Ricky over with Lester, and we can tell that from the way it's framed, it looks like that Ricky could be having a sexual encounter with Lester, which curiously the father doesn't even fully see as what are you doing with my high school son? Like whether he's gay or not, this isn't particularly appropriate. It seems to be the final thing that makes him decide to make a pass at Lester. And then finally the son says, you're right. That's how I make my money. I make $2,000. I'm that good. Any thoughts on why he did that? As opposed to saying that's not what happened.
Maybe it was like him trying to push his dad even further, closer to a brush again with his authenticity.
Yep.
Maybe he has inclinations that his dad is gay or has, whatever, but and is covering it up. So maybe it is him pushing him further in that direction.
And I think he does have inclinations about his dad. I thought that in the scene where he's being driven to school by his dad, who just got the fruit basket from the gay couple next door and doesn't understand. It's as you said, you were a business, or he somehow got that, and then he realizes, oh, you're actually a couple. And then he has to bring that up with his son, saying, why do they have to flaunt it? Why do they have to come here and flaunt it? And then he glances at his son, who's not. And I think the first thing the son actually says is maybe they don't think it's something to be ashamed of. And his father gives him a sharp look, and then he says, but I want to puke my guts out every time I see anything. He does this kind of cartoonish homophobic statement. And the dad's like, yeah, me too, son, me too. And so I think Ricky does know. And I guess adding to your use of the word authenticity, Nina, I think he really seems surprised when his father says, if I thought you were doing that, I would never want to see you again. And I don't think that Ricky thought that was true. I think he thought on some level that whatever his father did, however much of a blowhard he was, even if he beat the crap out of him, locked him in an institution for years, he assumed that his father on some level, on some unchallengeable level, loved him. And so my sense of it, it's kind of a searing moment to me, is because he says, really? And then he flips and says, yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Everything he just said is exactly right. And I think that's heartbreaking for Ricky, I think, because then his father's like, get out. But he also may be where, this is how Ricky breaks the gravitational. He's got to get out of that house, because he could easily get trapped. Like, I have to stay here for my mother. I have to stay here for my father. And in a way, the dad may have kind of given him an out, like, wow, you don't see me. You're never going to see me. And if you ever did see me, you can't see me through. You only can see, quote unquote, me through the lens of all of your own repressions and insecurities and fears and performances and so on. So I thought that was an important moment. I remember the first time I saw the movie, I was like, why would he, encourage the fantasy projections that his dad was making? And I thought it was almost like a thought experiment of, well, if that's true, if that's really true, that you want nothing to do with me, based on something I may or may not have done, then let's establish that, and then I can leave. And because then he says later with Jane, when Jane says, my parents will come looking for me, he simply says, mine won't. So, but it goes back to that authenticity. He is on his own. And it's sad in a way to break away from the parents like that, but it's sadder not to. And melodrama is a lot about children either being destroyed by not being able to break away from parents, or going through the admittedly very painful process of breaking away from them. And Charlotte will have a very abrupt scene of breaking with her mom, which devastates her at first, nearly sends her back into a nervous breakdown. And then we see her do her final reconstruction. Melodrama does seem to make the case that you guys are a younger demographic, but it does seem to make the case that it's not only is it all right to outgrow your parents and quote unquote leave them, it's necessary. It's important. It's really painful. But that kind of leaving of your parents, where you come into your own, granted, some parents, possibly like Ricky Fitz's dad, can't handle it. You're dead to them. Other parents won't like it, and then they'll see you for the first time. Like even with parents, being authentic with parents, and I probably don't have to tell you guys this, it can be really hard, especially when that authenticity you're feeling is at odds with what they hope for you or think you are. It's really scary and difficult, but it's in the same realm as sacrifice, that hopefully one doesn't have a parent like Ricky Fitz's parent, but in a way you have to give parents the chance, I'd say this as a parent, to be startled at who you really are. But then you've also given the parent an opportunity to say, I care about you, whatever that is. I thought I knew what that is. Now you're telling me that's not. And I'm kind of like trying to figure that out, but I don't care. Like, this is about, me caring about you, and the fact that I'm wrong about, or that I'm worried that you're some way that I would like to protect you from or something. It doesn't matter, because in the end, the only question worth asking is how are you, and who are you? And I suppose yet another thing that melodrama tries to, I keep saying it re-sacralizes the world. It also tries to reintroduce authenticity and sincerity. And we've learned how to fake these things. Like the used car salesman. When I was a kid, in high school, I got a job at a used car a lot, and I was terrible at it because I didn't know why people should buy these junky cars, and I wasn't doing very well. And the used car salesman pulled me aside and said, "Listen, with these customers, you've got to be sincere. Once you can fake that, you've got it made." And I realized that this is probably not going to be my career. But fake sincerity and is the thing that's so difficult is that faking an emotion often appears more real than simply being honest. And being honest isn't as dramatic. It isn't as performative. It isn't necessarily as persuasive. And you can fake sincerity. You can fake authenticity. You can fake concern. And sometimes when you're faking it, you're more convincing because you're faking. And so you can contrive it any way you want. I think where Ricky, as you suggest, has this edge is he doesn't fake. He doesn't seem to know how to. He just answers. Even when his dad's beating him up, he's like, "What? How did you get into that cabinet?" I made a copy of your keys. Why? I wanted to show the Nazi plate. And he's just saying exactly what he did. While the father continues to hit him. Okay, well, we're up to 9 and a little past. Any final shout outs, or are we good for now? I've the second prompt is up. I think about 5 or 6 of you got to, which thank you. That was helpful. I did put up the third prompt. Now, this is probably for Jacob's benefit. Don't the prompts are often complicated a little bit. Like I present these complicated prompts, but it's notice that the word count is 300, maybe 500. So I want the prompts to be complicated. I want them to enrich your experience. I want them to open up multiple levels, but you can't address them all. So don't try and match the complexity of the prompt with like, how can I do this? They're more like free writes. So I have an Amy Winehouse song, you know I'm no good, along with Amazing Grace, the traditional gospel, and I present one as a breakthrough song and one as a breakdown song. Amy Winehouse, well, we know her story, but also in her songs, you see this repeated arriving at a certain point that becomes a point of breakdown. And then Amazing Grace, that saved a wretch like me, we see coming to that breakdown point, and being able, mostly through the community of the church or the religion or the religious community, having the resilience to endure the breakdown point to where it becomes a breakthrough point. So that's in the second prompt. Third prompt, I talk about the mise-en-scène. It's more cinematic, and you'll be doing some samples where all the different ways you can talk about what is in the shot, what's inside the shot, in terms of, and I list like 5 or 6 of them. So have some fun with that, but just remember that with the prompts, you'll probably feel more from the prompt than you can necessarily put into the response. But these are also mini preparations for the midterm and the final, because in the midterm, you're basically going to get a grandiose prompt for the midterm and for the final, and then you're going to write 5 to 7 pages, so you will spend more time. But these are just warm-ups, kind of locating yourself, orienting yourself in terms of these various prompts. And one thing I should mention, I don't know if I put this in my description of the format of the midterm and the final, but the midterm will feature, it will refer to melodramas we've seen, but it will also bring in a melodrama we haven't. So the fun of the midterm, at least for me, will be the question will ask you to say things about Broken Blossom, American Beauty, about all this stuff we're talking about, but it will also ask you to bring into the conversation a melodrama that we haven't discussed. For me, that's going to be fun. So you'll see the movie. You're going to have 4 days to do the midterm, to find a window to do the midterm. So I will give you the URL for the melodrama that isn't one that we discussed, and it'll also be fun to talk about it in subsequent classes. Okay, so are we good for now out there in movie land? Yeah, okay. Nobody's freaking out. Oh, can I repeat the thing about the midterm, Mohammed? Yeah, so you're going to get a prompt. Your answer is going to be 5 to 7 pages. It may say something like, find the scene where Lester decides to not pursue Angela as a moment of re-sacralization. Find a similar moment in this melodrama that we haven't seen, but that you will see. And of course, I'll pick a melodrama that has very strong generic hallmarks. So you should be able to do this. Is that a little better, Mohammed? I'll write that out a little bit and put it as an announcement too. Okay. All right, guys. Thanks for coming by. And what am I gonna do? I'm gonna